Hey there, everybody. I hope you're doing well, ready for another video lecture. We are finally going to be talking about the Civil War. It's very exciting. This is like one of those things where this is kind of like what our whole class has been leading up to and building up to from the very beginning. And I'm not going to lie, this is something that I really enjoy, so you might have to hit that button. You know what button I'm talking about? Wee nerd alert. You know what I mean? Oh, okay. So, anyway, this is actually more of like a setup video, so we're not going to talk about as much like the things actually happening as much as the two sides, the North and the South during the Civil War. And I'm kind of breaking it up into three different sections here. Um, Advantages slash disadvantages for each side, and then their goals and the strategies to get those goals. So we're going to start with the advantages and disadvantages, and these all three kind of overlap a little bit. So just hang in there if I say something that maybe is a little bit confusing. The North has four times the population of the South. So obviously we're starting with the North. And basically, that's a huge advantage in a war, right? You have more people that you can call on to fight your war for you. You have more people who can work and create things and then have supplies and enforce your will on the other side. They have a great economy based on manufacturing as well as farming food. So not so much the southern side of things where they have the cash crops, but they have a lot of wheat and corn and animals, things like that. The North has 70% of the nation's railroads when this starts, which is a pretty big deal because railroads are the thing that's going to be most efficient when it comes to moving men and supplies for your armies. It means that the North can basically produce everything at home and move its army wherever it needs to go fight using the railroads and using the factories in the North that we've talked about. Also, when the South secedes, the North gets to keep one big advantage since the North is aligned with our federal government. Sometimes you'll hear the North side called the Federals because it's technically the federal government, and that's that the Navy stays. So the South doesn't really have a Navy at all when this war starts, and the North has the whole U.S. Navy. That's going to be important later. Um, that's going to be a pretty big advantage when one side, if you look at a map, the United States has a lot of coastline, the South needs to trade in order to be profitable, and your Navy can stop that. Disadvantages that the North has actually has more to do with its goals. Sometimes you'll see that a lot of the best officers in the United States Army went over to the southern side. That's kind of true. A lot of good officers did, but there were also a lot of good northern officers, so you can take with that what you will. It's not necessarily like wrong per se. And then, but a big part that's going to be the biggest northern disadvantage is they don't get to fight in the north very often. They're usually fighting in the south, where a lot of the people living there aren't going to like them. They aren't going to try and help the soldiers in any way. They might even be truly hostile. Talking about the Southern advantages, this is one of those things where maybe in historical hindsight it looks crazy that this was a war at all, but you got to remember that at the time, that's not always how people operate, and it was a very realistic thing, especially when you look at the goals that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, that they could win this war to a lot of Southerners. Their biggest advantage is they get to fight on home turf. The civilians and citizens who live there might help them. They know the lay of the land. A lot of soldiers are going to believe they are fighting to protect their homes, which is pretty big motivation to somebody to maybe lay down their life as opposed to knowing you're going to go to take over someone else's home, which isn't as motivating. They fought a war on the defensive, which is just at this time in history a lot easier and to do, a lot more effective. And you'll see if you want to sit down and learn about all these battles, usually whenever one side killed a lot more of the other side, it's because they got to sit down and defend an area rather than have to attack. It's just one of the kind of rules of warfare at this time. Disadvantages, they have a tiny population compared to the North, and a lot of that population is enslaved. They are not going to arm these people who are enslaved. So, numbers wise, they got a much smaller population to call on. They do not have a lot of factories, they don't have a lot of the railroads in the country. So, they aren't going to be able to produce most of the uniforms, the weapons, the gunpowder, the ammunition, and all those things that an army needs. They aren't necessarily going to be able to produce and supply their soldiers very effectively. Um, and it's not, it's sometimes it's even more basic things than what you think of. There's one of the most famous battles of the Civil War that we'll talk about. The Battle of Gettysburg started basically because there were a bunch of Southern soldiers heard a rumor that there were a bunch of extra shoes that they could get and basically go take from the Northern soldiers, which tells you that a lot of them were walking around barefoot. So, all sorts of kind of supply problems like that are going to be a huge issue. They don't have a navy, which means that they can grow all the cotton in the world, but they aren't going to be able to export it and make money because the Union does have a navy and can kind of stop all of that from happening. And there's not a lot they can do about that. Um, and I believe that kind of wraps it up for the advantages, disadvantages. So basically, North has more people because it has more cities, more factories, more railroads. It has the Army and the Navy. Technically, the South, but they do have to fight a war on enemy turf. The South gets to fight more at home, but has a much smaller population, terrible supply problems for their army, and doesn't have a navy like at all. But the goals and strategies and kind of what they have to do um, is going to change how this whole war kind of lasts. So the North actually has a much tougher goal than the South. They have to go and impose their will on 11 states. And again, if you look at a map of the Confederacy, these are large states, land area, large. They don't have large populations. There's a lot of kind of just farms there and wild areas, but they are physically huge. So that's a very tough thing to do. The U.S. government is going to use something called the Anaconda Plan, which basically means you surround parts of the South and then you cut it into more manageable chunks and you squeeze gradually. So they immediately start a blockade of the South. They're going to try and take the Mississippi River. Okay, that's our first chunk we're going to learn, and you'll see as we go through, and maybe I'll have another mini lesson on the Anaconda Plan. But anyway, it's all about squeezing the South. It's going to take a while for this plan to succeed, and they kind of know that. In addition to that, they're always trying to take Richmond. So the two capitals of the two countries, Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, are only 100 miles apart. And there are a ton of battles that center around the two sides trying to take one or the other. Usually the North trying to take Richmond, because that would be seen as a quick way to end the war, whereas the Anaconda Plan is a very slow way to win the war. I think you can guess which one ends up being successful. Um, so yeah, they see they have this big issue. And so the goal they have is to subdue the southern states. The strategy is going to be the Anaconda Plan, using your navy and your larger army. You cut off parts of the South from other parts of the South, and then you can gradually move in and squeeze, cut those into smaller chunks. But it's going to take a really long time. The Southern goals, they want independence. They theoretically have it, whether you want to say they do or don't. There's not really a wrong answer to that. Miss Whistle and I have had a lot of arguments about this. You know how it goes. But anyway, there's not like a right or wrong answer. Like some really good historians will say they were independent. Some really good historians will say they were not. Uh, so they have this idea that if they can just make it bloody and expensive for the North to keep the Union together, eventually the people in the North will vote out the politicians who want the war and they'll say, we're done with war. Let them be independent. Okay, so they just need to outlast the North, basically. So they're going to do that. They're going to protect Richmond, and that's why there's that 100-mile span between Washington, D.C. and Richmond has so many battles fought in it. They're going to protect Richmond as best they can and just kind of play on the defensive for the most part. They also want to try and gain recognition from other countries. If they can get England or France to help them, that's going to make life a lot harder for the U.S. government, especially since those countries have a navy, and the South can't produce guns, but they can buy them. So they believe in something called King Cotton diplomacy. Basically, the thought is that England and France are so reliant on Southern cotton for their industrial revolutions, which they're going through right now, that they will come and support the Southerners. And we'll talk about that. That international relations angle really comes into play later on in the war, but I'm not going to talk about that just yet. And I believe that's kind of the big thing. So big takeaways here. Okay, the North has a much bigger population, has the Army and the Navy on their side, but they have to impose their will on the South. The South still has a lot of good leaders, even if they're like kind of run-of-the-mill soldiers, aren't very good, and they can't, or well, they were pretty good, but anyway. and they have to play the defensive rather than the offensive. But they don't have a navy, and they don't have a way to produce weapons of war. So the North is going to cut off parts of the South and squeeze them. The South is going to try and play defense and maybe get recognition from other countries. All right, so that's really all we got for this time, and hope you have a good day. That's really it.